Hello, Chem 1110 students. This is Dr. Dana. I am your instructor for this semester where we're going to look at chemistry and learn sort of that first part of chemistry, which is the science of change. The approach we're going to take to this is sort of said by the title of the book, Chemistry Atoms First. We're going to look at atoms first, which are the smallest particle of matter, and we're going to learn about atoms and how they function, how they exist, and then we will put atoms together and make molecules. And once we understand molecules and some of their properties, then we'll let molecules react, and then we can learn about chemical reactions. And the whole point for studying chemistry is to be able to develop chemical reactions that will produce things that people want, or to avoid chemical reactions that are detrimental, such as explosions. So the study of chemistry is extremely important and interesting. So we are going to start out by defining what chemistry is, and it's the study of all matter and the changes that it undergoes. So of course, then we have to know what matter is. And matter is anything that has mass and occupies space. So the air that you're breathing, even though you can't see it, is made up of matter because it occupies space and it does have mass, even though the mass is very small. A lot of changes can take place in different kinds of matter. And here's an example on the upper left, methane gas. You can't see it. You can't actually smell methane gas. The natural gas that comes to your home has had a sulfur compound added to it so that you can smell it, because otherwise you'd never be able to detect a natural gas leak. But here we're using its chemical reaction of combustion to cook food. To the right of that, you have a piece of farm equipment that's rusting. It's a different kind of chemical change. In the lower left, you've got maybe Alka-Seltzer tablets that are fizzing in water, which is producing carbonated water that could be used for stomach upset. And on the right there, we have one of our favorite kinds of chemical changes, and that is cooking. So we're going to take a look at these kinds of changes that things can undergo. But when we do, we have to understand that we use a scientific method. Whenever scientists study something, they use a scientific method, which is a very well-developed set of guidelines that allow us to make sure that conclusions we draw are defendable or defensible. So it starts out by making observations, doing some experiments, observing the results, looking for patterns, trying to explain the data. And once we think that we have a possible explanation, we form a hypothesis. If you leave a steel item out in the rain, it will rust. For instance, a bicycle or a yard tool. If you test this over and over and the hypothesis is always true, then you may get a theory that evolves, which could have to do with how you can improve lawn tools or farm equipment so that it doesn't rust. Okay. So that is how we actually study chemistry. And now we're going to talk about what we study, which is matter. And the first thing scientists tend to do is it's a sorting function. They classify the various things they're looking at. As we know, biologists look at the animal kingdom and the plant kingdom. And in the animal kingdom, there's a lot of different species, fish, reptiles, dogs. So our sorting function is a little bit simpler. We have substances and mixtures, and substances are pure materials. They're always the same, no matter where you find them. And I gave some examples here. Some of these examples are made up of one kind of atom, like iron or mercury. It's just the iron atom or the mercury atom, whereas there are other pure material substances like salt and water that are made up of different kinds of atoms. Water is H2O, two hydrogens with one oxygen. It doesn't matter if that water comes out of the Atlantic or the Pacific Ocean, it's the same thing. And we can identify pure substances by their properties. And, that may be its appearance or its smell, or it might be how it conducts electricity. On the other hand, we have mixtures, and mixtures are a physical combination of two or more substances. And we can break that down further into homogeneous mixtures, which are the same throughout, and heterogeneous mixtures, which vary as you look at a sample of that mixture. So a homogeneous mixture, which is the same throughout, is often called a solution. And one of those components is something like water, and it's mixed with salt, and it's just a physical mixture. And if you take some of the salt water off the top of a container of salt water and some off the bottom, it's going to have all the same properties because it is homogeneous. An example I have here for a heterogeneous mixture is trail mix, and we all know the chocolate falls to the bottom. And so it's definitely not heterogeneous if you take a sample, or it is heterogeneous if you take a sample from the bottom, you get more chocolate than if you take a sample from the top. All right. So if you have a mixture, which is just a physical combination of substances, you can separate them by physical means. And you may have done this in grade school, where you have a mixture of iron filings and sand, and you can pull those iron filings out with a magnet. That is a physical property, that it's magnetic, and you've used a physical means to separate the components of this mixture. There's some other physical separations, and there's three depicted here. There's extraction, which is where you make coffee. Distillation, which is a way that you can separate two liquids into their components. And the third one is thin layer chromatography. And once again, you may have done this, where you put a drop of an ink on a piece of paper, and you let that paper get wet, and you see the components of the ink come apart because it's a physical property in terms of how well they dissolve in the water and how well they move up the paper. So these various processes will separate the components of the mixture, but that does not change it. There is no chemical reaction involved. Now, the other thing about matter that we need to think about are the various states of matter. And we've got three here: solid, liquid, and gas. And we have pictures of some of this red stuff in three flasks. The solid is a very it doesn't conform to the shape of the vessel, and if you look at the close-up, those particles, those atoms are lined up in a very rigid pattern. They make crystals. But if you look at a liquid, things are close together, but they're not so close together that they can't move over one another, and you get that fluid behavior. In the gas, now these particles are moving very quickly, and they may bounce off of each other, but they don't actually interact at all. And so they have a very significant separation from one another. So very close, not quite so close, and very separated. The other thing about these is states of matter that you need to know is how they interact with the vessel. the solid does not conform to the shape, whereas the liquid takes on the shape, but not the volume, and the gas takes on both the shape and the volume of the container. So when we are talking about states of matter, in principle, everything can exist in all three states of matter. Now, mercury is a liquid metal, and most of us have never seen solid mercury, and we don't see gaseous mercury. It's only liquid mercury. But this is an example of one that we can see in all three states, and that's water. So you have the liquid in the beaker, you have the solid as ice cubes on top of the watch glass, and because you're boiling the water, you're getting steam. So you have the solid on the watch glass, the liquid in the beaker, and the gas on top. So you can theoretically convert from one state of matter to the other without changing the identity at all. Okay, there's some other properties of matter we're interested in. The first are quantitative, and these are ones that you can measure, and these are ones that we do a lot of in science. The word starts out with quantity, so you can think of that to help you remember that it is something that can be measured. The other one are qualitative properties, and so here we have quality. And so these are not measured, they are observed. So physical properties, ones that can be observed and measured without changing the identity, examples are color, melting point, and boiling point. A physical change, though, would change from one state of matter to the other. The other properties of matter the terminology we need to know are extensive properties, are ones that depend on how much stuff you have, such as the mass or the volume. But an intensive is something that is determined by the material itself and the spacing of the particles, things like temperature and density. So we're also going to look at chemical properties, of course, because this is a chemistry class. And chemical properties are those that a substance exhibits when it interacts with something else, such as flammability, that methane gas burning, or corrosiveness, how the oxygen is reacting with the iron in that piece of farm equipment. Chemical changes will also occur, and that's a result of the interaction of two different components that causes a change in composition. And, here we have digestion. You eat a piece of candy and it turns into energy, so your body is going through a lot of chemical reactions. Combustion, once again, the burning of that methane gas, that natural gas on your stove. And oxidation is that rusting of metal. When the oxygen in the air combines with the iron in the steel, it forms rust, which is Fe2O3. You've got some iron, you've got some oxygen, and that rust will fall off. And so you no longer have the pure iron anymore. And that's it. You can move on to the second video now. Thank you.